Oh my god, it's attacking the city! What is it, boss? It's a big fucking monster! What kind of monster, boss? A fucking gorilla!
Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is the 2005 remake of King Kong. Now, recently, me and my friend Jeremy reviewed all the other King Kong movies leading up to this. I did not review this movie with him because, at the time I recorded those reviews, this was the only King Kong movie I did not rewatch when we recorded those reviews, so I decided to go solo with this review, even though later on in this video I'm gonna play a short review on this movie that my friend Jeremy did. Now, we also recorded a review of Kong Skull Island, but that video is gonna go up after this video. Now, this of course is a remake of the 1933 classic of the same name, and it's the second King Kong remake because King Kong was already remade in 1976. Now, I am reviewing this movie and the other King Kong films for Horror Month, even though it's very debatable whether King Kong could actually qualify as a horror franchise, and this one in particular, it does have horror elements, but I really would not call this a full-fledged horror film. Honestly, I wouldn't call any of the King Kong movies full-fledged horror films, but I think enough of them have enough horror elements where I think you can make a case for the whole series kind of qualifying to a certain extent. But here's the thing with me, I don't really consider genre to be a set-in-stone thing, especially with something like King Kong, where it really does sort of cross over into many different genres, like action-adventure, science fiction, and yes, a little horror. And with this one in particular, there's also a lot of character drama. Now, this film was co-written and directed by Peter Jackson, who prior to this directed films like Bad Taste, Meet the Feebles, Dead Alive, Heavenly Creatures, The Frighteners, and of course the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which many would consider to be his magnum opus, and it probably is. I mean, my personal favorite Peter Jackson film is Bad Taste, but it's not really fair to compare something like Bad Taste to something like Lord of the Rings or even this movie, because Bad Taste is a completely different film from something like Lord of the Rings or something like this movie. But this is Peter Jackson coming right off of the success of the Lord of the Rings films, which really were freaking huge when they came out. Now, Peter Jackson has always been a huge fan of the original King Kong, and I think his love for the original definitely comes through with this movie. Now, I think this movie got some pretty good reviews when it came out, and there are still a lot of people who like this movie, but I've noticed, especially in the last few years, there's been kind of a backlash against this movie. Like, there are a lot of people who really don't like this film. Some people feel like it's overlong, which, to a certain extent, I will agree with that. At the same time, though, given what they're trying to do with this particular King Kong story, I almost feel like it needed to be as long as it was. But personally, I liked this movie. I could see some of the issues that certain people have with it, but I liked it. Now, I prefer the original, but I still think this is a pretty well done remake. And I actually think Peter Jackson does a great job at paying tribute to the original film, but still making it his own. Now, this movie has the same basic story as the original film, and the same characters, but the characters in this movie are radically different from their counterparts in the original film. Most notably, the character of Jack Driscoll. In the original film, Jack Driscoll was a sailor and was sort of a macho man's man, and he was kind of a misogynistic jerk, but he still had a likability to him, mainly in how well acted he was, and also a lot of the sexism that was in the original King Kong was a product of its time. But in this movie, Jack Driscoll, who's played by Adrien Brody in this film, is a playwright and is completely different from the Jack Driscoll of the original film. But the movie centers around a filmmaker named Carl Denham, who is trying to make a movie, but his financiers are starting to pull out because they don't like what he's given them so far, and they feel like he's wasting their money. And also, the actress he had dropped out of the project. He ends up meeting this out-of-work actress named Ann Darrow, who decides to be in the film when she finds out that the movie is being written by Jack Driscoll, who is a playwright that she really likes. So Carl, Ann, Jack Driscoll, Carl's crew, and the crew of this ship set sail for what many of the people on the ship think is Singapore, but it turns out that Carl has them going to an uncharted island. On this island, they encounter a hostile tribe who actually end up killing some of Carl's crew, and eventually Ann Darrow is kidnapped, and this tribe sacrifices her to their god, which is a giant gorilla called King Kong. And very much like in the original film, a lot of the men go off into the jungles of the island to try to save Anne, and they encounter dinosaurs and other creatures on this island, and many of them don't make it. But eventually Anne is saved, and Kong is captured and taken back to New York City, where he eventually escapes and starts terrorizing the city. And that's the basic plot line of this movie, and once again, it's the same basic plot line as the original film, but a lot is changed. One notable difference is really in the characterization of King Kong himself. In the original film, Kong was really just a monster, but in this film they definitely try to humanize Kong, even though he's not a human, and you feel a lot more sympathy for King Kong. Now, some of the other King Kong movies have also tried to humanize Kong as well, so that isn't really a new thing that this movie does, but it is a difference from the original film where Kong, once again, was just a monster. And Ann Darrow feels a lot more sympathy for King Kong. Now, in the film, Jack Black plays Carl Denham. Now, in the original film, Carl Denham was kind of a jackass, only because by taking these people on this adventure, he did get them in danger, and a lot of what happens in the original King Kong was kind of Carl Denham's fault, but he was still a likable character. There was still something genuine about him. And a lot of that was due to Robert Armstrong's charisma in the original film, but Jack Black's version of Carl Denham is a complete scumbag. Like, he's borderline a villain in this movie. Like, all he cares about is his vision and his fame, and he really doesn't care whose lives he puts in danger. Now, in the film, Naomi Watts plays Ann Darrow, and she does a fantastic job in this movie, and there's a lot of really good characterization with her character. And I like how in the movie they really do utilize the fact that she's an entertainer, and she uses that as a way to entertain and tame Kong, so Kong doesn't kill her, even though I don't think Kong would have intentionally killed her, but if she didn't do something, I'm pretty sure Kong would have accidentally killed her, though. I also think it's interesting how at the end of the movie, Kong doesn't actually take her. She actually goes to Kong because she realizes that she's the only person who could actually calm Kong down. In the movie, Adrien Brody plays Jack Driscoll, who, as I pointed out already, is a playwright in this movie, and I actually really liked this movie's interpretation of Jack, and I thought Adrien Brody did a great job in this film. But one character in this movie who really stood out to me was Preston, who is Carl Denham's personal assistant, who's played by Colin Hanks in the film, who's actually Tom Hanks' son, but I really liked this character because in the film you see him start out as Carl Denham's right-hand man pretty much, but as the movie goes on he starts to really become disillusioned with Denham and starts to realize just how much of a scumbag this guy really is, and at the end of the film where they have King Kong held at the theater, he gives Carl Denham this like condemning look, like, look at what you've become. Now, in the film, Serkis does the motion capture for King Kong, Kong. Now, Serkis worked with Jackson before in The Lord of the Rings, where he played Gollum, but Andy Serkis really does give King Kong a distinct sense of humor and a distinct human personality, even though, once again, this isn't a human we're dealing with. And he does a good job at really making us sympathize with this beast. Andy Serkis also plays one of the human characters in the film. He plays the ship's cook, Lumpy. And once again, while I know some people don't like this movie, I personally enjoy Peter Jackson's remake of King Kong. Once again, it's not a film I can see myself watching all the time. I still prefer the original film, and if somebody asked me which I would rather watch, yes, I would rather watch the original film, but I still think this is a good remake. And the movie does have some cute little tributes to the original film, like, for example, this screenplay that Jack Driscoll wrote. There's a scene where they're shooting a scene from the script, like, on the ship, and the dialogue from the script is basically dialogue from the original film. And also, at the end of the film, they do this little thing where King Kong is chained up on the stage at the theater, and they have these actors dressed up as the natives, and it's basically supposed to look like the natives from the original film, and they even play some of the same music from the original film in the scene where they find the natives performing their rituals. There's also this funny, almost meta joke in the film where at the beginning you find out that the actress that Carl Denham was originally working with, she left them and went over to RKO. RKO was the company that produced and distributed the original King Kong, and it also implies that in this movie's universe, Carl Denham is sort of a rival of Merian C. Cooper. Merian C. Cooper was the man who co-directed the original King Kong. I thought that was really funny. And also, the special effects in this movie is amazing. Like, yes, you could tell a lot of it is CGI, but I would say that most of it holds up pretty well, because I've noticed a lot of early 2000s films don't really have the best CGI, or at least they don't have CGI that holds up too well. Watching this movie again, I actually think most of the special effects hold up pretty well, and I mean, yes, you could tell it's CGI effects, but it's still well done effects. And yes, it doesn't have the same magic as Willis O'Brien's stop-motion effects in the original film, but that really wouldn't have worked for a 2005 movie. Now, I don't think it's a perfect movie by any means. Like, there are certain points in the film where I thought, okay, that was a little overdone. For example, the natives sequence. In that one scene, I just thought it was so overdone. It was so, like, they made them too vicious. They made them too almost zombie-like, and I didn't particularly care for that sequence in the film. And another thing that really didn't work about this movie, for me personally, is when they tried to recreate lines from the original film. Like, Carl Denham at some points in this movie says some of the same lines of dialogue that he said in the original film. The issue I had with that is, like, when Carl Denham says in the original film after they capture King Kong, "We're millionaires, boys, I'll share it with all of you." You believe it. You buy it. He says the same thing when they capture King Kong in this movie, but you don't believe it. You don't buy it at all. And maybe that was the point, because this version of Carl Denham is such a sleazebag that he wants to be charismatic, but he really isn't, but it just didn't work. Another reason why I don't think it worked is because that was dialogue that was written for a film in the early 1930s, and back in the 1930s, acting styles were so much different than acting styles today, and dialogue, at least in American films back in the 30s, was much more exaggerated, so once again, it just didn't work for me. But despite some of those problems, and despite the movie's length, I still think it's a pretty good remake, and if you haven't seen this movie, I definitely recommend it. Now I want to cut to a few short reviews on this film that some friends of mine did. One of those reviews was done by my friend Jeremy, who previously reviewed all the King Kong movies with me.
Hi, I'm Jeremy, and here's my review of Peter Jackson's 2005 remake of King Kong. Well, I love it. I first saw it when it came out in the theaters, and I was just amazed by it all. It was thrilling, it was adventurous. It is a little too long, But, you know, I can overlook that because, my God, it was just so entertaining. You know, the special effects are incredible, you know, especially with when Kong is fighting the dinosaurs, you know, that really just it takes you into that gruesome kind of fight, you know, you feel every punch, you know. And the characters are all very entertaining too, especially Carl Denham, who, you know, as opposed to his 1933 counterpart, who, while kind of crazy and reckless for bringing all those people onto this dangerous voyage, he was still a likable guy. This Carl Denham, on the other hand, is a complete scumbag. He lies, he cheats, he steals, he puts his film above all else, including human life. I mean, there's that one part after his sound editor, Mike, is killed by the natives. You know, he says, you know, Mike died doing what he believed in. You know, once we finish the film, I'm going to dedicate it in Mike's memory, and we're going to donate the proceeds to his wife and kids. And then when his cameraman Herb dies, he says the exact same thing. I mean, he's a total lowlife. There's a deleted scene in the movie where the crew have to make a raft across this very disgusting swamp, and while they're doing that, they're attacked by this really huge swamp monster known as a piranhadon. And as they're being attacked, Carl Denham's assistant, Preston, is the one holding the camera. And, you know, he just goes, Preston, whatever you do, don't let go of the camera, you know, because that's his film. And when Preston finally makes it across, you know, he's, you know, exhausted from fighting for his life, and he's, you know, struggling to, it looks like, to even walk. And Carl, you know, just comes running towards him, and he's like, Preston, oh, thank God. You know, you think he's going to help him up, you know, help him get to, you know, safety or whatever, but instead he just takes the camera from him, you know, and bundles it up. Which really shows you, enforces what a complete scumbag Carl Denham is. And if that weren't bad enough, as one of the random crewmen are walking up out of the water, the piranhadon leaps out and attacks the guy and starts swallowing him whole, all while Carl is recording it. Although to be fair, he didn't realize while he was testing to see if it was still working that the monster was going to do that, but he didn't stop while it was happening, which speaks volumes about him. I also just love how in this version, you know, you really get to see the more gruesome aspects of Skull Island than you did in, you know, the 1933 original. You know, especially the spider pit scene is definitely one of the most gruesome scenes because, you know, you feel the character's terror and their agony as they're attacked by this, you know, limitless assault of giant bugs. And the most gruesome death in that scene is by far Lumpy's death, played by Andy Serkis, because he's attacked by creatures that are known as carnictus, which are like really large, parasitic, you could almost call them giant tapeworms. And, you know, they're really horrific, ugly, gruesome looking things. You know, they're these big masses. And then out of those big masses, you see this thin, long, pink, fleshy-like neck with rows and rows of teeth. And, you know, they start to attack him, and they get on his leg and his arm, and, you know, their mouths cover each body part, and it's like they're already, you know, chewing and digesting, and he's alive to feel all that. And it's just a merciless onslaught. And, you know, the added special effects, you know, that we have today just let you see how these brave men do suffer and die for their cause to rescue Anne, which makes it all the more tragic. You know, but you know, as I was saying though, this movie is just fantastic. I think you can tell that Peter Jackson has a lot of admiration for the original, and this is almost like a loving tribute to it. So, yeah, it's a great one.
So Peter Jackson's King Kong is easily one of the best remakes of all time. It is my personal favorite of the entire franchise. As much as you heard me gush about the original King Kong, this one, it's such a labor of love. You know, it's done so much out of appreciation for the original and wanting to live up to it and wanting to do a huge grand tribute to it. And there's just so much that's great about it. From parts where they like flat out recreate sequences from the original, and the way that they've updated certain characters. I love Adrien Brody's reinterpretation of Jack. That was such a great retrack. Now he's on a deckhand. Now he's a Hollywood screenwriter, and he's like he's being forced to come along on this journey he didn't want to be a part of. There's a lot of really cool layers, and man, Jack Black, this is probably like my favorite performance of his, because I mean, he plays like this director who's so driven and so almost like borderline psychotic about getting this movie made that he starts to lose his mind, you know, and it's crazy to watch, and it starts to get sinister after a while. It's a really cool new layer to add to it, and I do love the fact that he's the one who says it at the end. It was Beauty Killed the Beast. It was great that they kept that theme from the original and really, you know, they tamper with just enough, but they keep just enough as it was, you know. And it works so great as a modern retelling of this story. Yeah, Pete obviously has nothing but love and admiration for the original. It just pours out into the screen. And I really especially loved the character of the actor who is known for adventure films, and now he's in an actual adventure, and he doesn't know how to, like, handle himself or what to do. And then at the end, well, not at the end, but like halfway through, he actually manages to become an actual hero himself. That whole sequence where he starts mowing down the creatures with the Tommy gun, that was really good. Yeah, there's so much cool stuff that they added to it. I love the shout out to Dead Alive with the Sumatran rat monkey box in the background. Like, Peter just couldn't help himself, but give a shout out to it. I really loved the reinterpretation of the dino fight scene, because if you actually watch them back to back, there are moments where it's almost verbatim. Like, even after Kong kills the dinosaur, he starts like playing with his jaw and stuff. If you go back to the original, Kong did the exact same thing, just in stop motion. So that was a really cool updating of it. If I recommend you check out the director's cut if you haven't seen it. It adds in like another 45 minutes of footage, and it's really cool and interesting to watch. I feel like it's probably Pete's like preferred version of the movie, but I might be saying a bit much. So if you haven't seen it, or you put off by it just because it's a remake, definitely do not avoid it. Definitely check it out when you get a chance, and I highly, highly recommend it. There's such a great love behind this movie, and I can watch it any day. It's so great. I love it.
I'm probably going to get a lot of hate for saying this, but I'm not really a big fan of Peter Jackson's version that much. I mean, I don't hate the film. It's not really bad. It doesn't do justice for me. I'm not drawn into it like most people were, because I saw this in the theater when I was 12 years old back in 2005 on Christmas Eve. And I remember the only positive thing I can say about it was when it came out, my dad showed me the original. Peter Jackson was also showing the famous lost spider pit scene that is lost, like the reenactment. That was pretty cool. And I also think that I do like the actors in the film. They weren't bad actor choice. I just did not think they were that, like, I wasn't like drawn to it. It wasn't the same to me as with like Fay Wray and the other actors. And Jack Black was not really bad as Carl Denham. He's just not the first actor that comes to mind who could have played Jack Denham. I think they should have picked maybe Josh Brolin or George Clooney for the part instead. And Naomi Watts was okay in the film. She was a good choice.
Walking in to see Peter Jackson's remake of King Kong, I was very skeptical because, at the time, I hated remakes. I hated the remake of The Shining, I hated the remake of Godzilla, and I even hated the remake of Nicolas Cage's career. But what I didn't take into consideration was Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson, for as far back as I can remember, was a big part of my childhood, even when I didn't know it. He did Bad Taste, Brain Dead, both of which were a big influence on my love of horror, and of course, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which in some ways were remakes of their own. So now, looking back, I really didn't have anything to worry about. This genius, and yes, he is a genius, wasn't going to come into a movie unless he knew exactly what he was doing. Never would he decide to choose a project that he felt would satisfy his wallet instead of his heart. And then I watched King Kong, and you know what? It is a worthy remake of the 1933 classic, and a shoo-in for one of the best movies of all time. The film stars a whole crapload of actors, but most notably Naomi Watts, Jack Black, Adrien Brody, And of course, the greatest motion capture actor of all time, Andy Serkis, as the titular character. And right off the bat, I will say that the acting in this is superb. Naomi Watts and Adrien Brody are obviously great, as they always are. But for me, my favorite performance comes from Jack Black. Now, I'm not saying that Jack Black was never good before this movie. I'm just saying that he wasn't given anything that could really show how great he was. Before this, he did a bunch of comedy movies that are good, but like I said, didn't let him showcase his acting chops like he did in this movie. And this was a hard role to do. The character he plays of this douche filmmaker who will do anything to make his film, even letting some of his crew die, could have been easily corny and over the top. And there are times when he does go over the top, but it's done in the right way, not like some other actors out there. The one thing I have to say that I had a problem with when it comes to Jack Black is that freaking line. It was beauty killed the beast. Look, I don't fault Jack Black for it, nor do I fault Peter Jackson for wanting to include it since it is one of the most famous quotes of all time, but Jesus, it really doesn't work here. It barely worked in the original, but in this one, it's, Like I said before, Naomi Watts and Adrien Brody are great. I love the chemistry that they build and how serious they take their roles. Yes, I miss Fay Wray, because in my opinion, her scream was way, way, way better than Naomi Watts's. But she did a great job still. And Andy Serkis, this dude should have won an Oscar for his motion capture. There are times when I still watch the film and I have to remind myself that this is not just a computer-simulated gorilla. There was a man behind there, doing all the motions that a gorilla would do. I forgot for how long, but I remember reading that he actually went to study the movements and mannerisms of gorillas in order to bring Kong to life. And that, my friends, is dedication. He was great as Gollum, and he's, in my opinion, even better in this, because he isn't playing a humanoid creature. He's playing an ape. Ask somebody else to do that, and trust me, you'll regret it. The fight scenes in this movie were brilliant. Talk about bringing your childhood fantasies to life. When you're a kid, you imagine that the creatures fighting are real, and when you watch this movie, you actually see what you imagined when you were younger. Kong takes on T-Rexes and the whole scene is thrilling and keeps you on the edge of your seat. The emotional parts with Kong are sweet and adorable. You really felt for him here, where in the first one, you just see him as a monster who is putting the blonde bombshell in danger. In this one, they're actually friends. They form an actual relationship. And you almost wish he would turn human so that the two can get married. It's that great of a love story. Other filmmakers have tried to do this thing, but only a few have succeeded. Others are too appalling to even be considered love stories. If you haven't seen the ending of the original, I won't spoil it for you, but in this one, you pretty much get the same thing. But because you are so in love with Kong and Naomi Watts, it is so crushing. Overall, this movie is amazing. A true modern classic, which should never be forgotten, and an example of how you remake a film successfully.
So, I hope you guys enjoyed my friend's takes on this movie, and that was my review on Peter Jackson's remake of King Kong, and my next movie review, which I already recorded with Jeremy, is the review on Kong Skull Island.